The story begins not with freedom, but with chains. Not with hope, but with despair. Yet from these darkest moments emerged the contradiction that would define a nation, a country born of the promise of liberty, yet built upon the shackles of bondage. In 1619, 20 and odd Africans stepped onto the shores of a young English colony called Jamestown, their arrival marking not just the beginning of slavery in what would become America, but the beginning of a revolution that would reshape the very foundations of human civilization. The year was 1619. The place was Point Comfort, Virginia, a small trading post at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. 3 English ships, the White Lion, the Treasurer, and the James, arrived carrying more than trade goods and supplies. They took human cargo, approximately 20 Africans who had been forcibly removed from their homeland, trafficked across the treacherous Atlantic, and sold into an uncertain future in the New World. This wasn't merely the first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans in English North America, though the exact number remains debated, with some scholars arguing for as few as 17. In contrast, others suggest as many as 30. This was the moment that would forever alter the trajectory of American history. The Spanish and Portuguese had been transporting enslaved Africans to their colonies for nearly a century before this moment. The Spanish colony of St. Augustine in Florida had been home to enslaved Africans since the 1560s. By 1619, some African people were already living and working in various Spanish and Portuguese territories throughout the Americas. But what happened at Point Comfort in 1619 was different in both scope and consequence. Here, in the heart of English America, the systematic exploitation of African labor would become the foundation of colonial prosperity, ultimately shaping the entire economic, social, and political development of what would become the United States of America. The 20 Africans who arrived in Virginia that August day came not from the west coast of Africa, as one might expect, but from the Caribbean island of Bermuda, which the English had begun colonizing in 1609. These men and women had been part of a larger group of Africans who had been captured during an English privateering raid on a Spanish ship, the San Juan Bautista. The San Juan Bautista had left Mexico's Veracruz port carrying a cargo of goods and enslaved Africans when it was intercepted by English privateers commanded by Captain Christopher Newport and George Yeardley. The English seized the ship, and rather than conducting a traditional naval battle, they found themselves with a more profitable prize: human beings. This detail is crucial to understanding the complex web of international politics, piracy, and commercial exploitation that characterized the early colonial period. The English weren't operating under the banner of some grand imperial strategy for the systematic importation of enslaved Africans. Instead, they were pirates who had found a particularly profitable cargo in human beings. The San Juan Bautista's captain, Antonio Vasquez, had actually been carrying these Africans from Mexico to their final destination in the Spanish colonies when the English privateers seized the ship. The Africans had been purchased or seized in Mexico. Many likely were brought there from Angola and other parts of West Africa as part of the Spanish slave trade. When the English privateers split their prize at Bermuda, they found themselves responsible for approximately 20 Africans they needed to sell quickly. The Caribbean islands, particularly those under Spanish and Portuguese rule, had their own complex economies based on sugar production and various forms of forced labor. But Virginia was different. The Jamestown colony, struggling to establish itself and desperate for labor to work the tobacco farms that were beginning to prove profitable, represented an opportunity for these English privateers to turn their human cargo into immediate profit. The timing was almost poetic in its historical significance. The 1619 arrival came on the heels of a massive shift in the English approach to colonization itself. Just 3 years earlier, in 1616, John Rolfe had successfully grown tobacco using seeds from the Spanish colonies. By 1619, the Virginia Company was actively encouraging settlers to grow tobacco as the colony's primary cash crop. But tobacco was extremely labor-intensive to cultivate, and the colony had been struggling to find enough workers to tend the fields and harvest the crop. The English colonists at Jamestown had been experimenting with various forms of labor since the colony's founding in 1607. Initially, they had relied heavily on the labor of indentured servants from England, who would work for a set period of years in exchange for passage to the New World and the promise of eventual freedom and land ownership. This system of indentured servitude had its roots in English common law and was considered a legitimate, if harsh, form of contract labor. The typical indentured servant would serve for 4 to 7 years, after which they would be granted their freedom and, importantly, a parcel of land to establish themselves as independent farmers. The transition from indentured servitude to racial slavery wasn't inevitable or immediate. In fact, the early colonial period in Virginia was marked by a surprisingly complex and fluid understanding of race, social status, and labor. The 20 Africans who arrived in 1619 weren't necessarily enslaved for life immediately upon arrival. Records from the period suggest that some of these Africans were treated initially as indentured servants rather than perpetual enslaved people. Several African men and women managed to purchase their freedom within a few years, and some even went on to acquire land and servants. One of the most fascinating and often overlooked aspects of early Virginia history is the story of African people who established themselves as free landowners in the 17th century. In 1635, for instance, an African man named Anthony Johnson successfully petitioned for the release of his indentured servant, John Casor, who was himself African. Casor, having served his term of indenture, was arguing that Johnson was wrongfully holding him in servitude beyond his contractual obligation. The court ruled in favor of Casor, demonstrating that at this early stage, the law still essentially treated servitude as a contractual matter rather than a racial status. This fluidity in the early colonial period raises profound questions about why and how slavery as a racial institution developed in Virginia. One key factor was the simple economics of tobacco cultivation. As tobacco prices rose and the industry expanded, plantation owners needed vast amounts of labor to work their fields. The indentured servant system, while functional, had significant limitations. Indentured servants eventually achieved freedom and became competitors for land and resources. They demanded higher wages and better conditions as the colony prospered. And perhaps most importantly, indentured servants could form alliances with other workers, creating the potential for collective action and resistance. The transition to racial slavery solved these problems for plantation owners in multiple ways. First, it removed the time limit on labor. Enslaved people and their descendants would work for life, providing a permanent workforce that could be inherited and traded like property. Second, racial slavery allowed plantation owners to classify workers based on immutable characteristics that couldn't be changed or escaped through contract. Third, and perhaps most importantly, racial slavery created a racial hierarchy that prevented alliances between different groups of workers by pitting Europeans against Africans in a system of permanent racial subordination. The demographic realities of colonial Virginia made this racial classification particularly appealing to English colonists. By the 1680s, the number of indentured servants coming to Virginia had declined significantly, while the number of enslaved Africans was increasing rapidly. This created a situation where white servants and free Africans could potentially outnumber white landowners, creating a demographic threat that some colonists interpreted as a potential for rebellion and social upheaval. By making skin color itself a marker of social status and legal status, Virginia's ruling class was able to create a system where even poor white servants could feel a sense of superiority over free Africans and enslaved people. The legal framework for racial slavery developed gradually throughout the 17th century, with key pieces of legislation gradually shifting from treating servitude as a contractual matter to treating it as a racial condition. The 1640 case of John Punch, an African servant who attempted to escape with 2 white servants, resulted in the court sentencing Punch to serve his master for life, while the white servants received additional years of service. This was one of the first documented cases where race became a determining factor in the length and conditions of servitude. But the legal foundation for permanent, inheritable racial slavery wasn't firmly established until the late 17th century. The crucial turning point came in 1662, when the Virginia Assembly passed a law stating that children would inherit the status of their mothers rather than their fathers. This meant that any child born to an enslaved woman would be born enslaved, regardless of who the father was. This legislation was revolutionary in its implications because it established the concept of hereditary slavery, ensuring that slavery would be passed down through generations. Combined with other laws passed in the 1670s and 1680s that gradually stripped free Africans of their civil rights and made interracial marriage illegal, Virginia was systematically creating a racial caste system that would define American society for centuries to come. The impact of these legal changes extended far beyond the legal system itself. They reshaped the entire social and economic structure of Virginia and, by extension, the whole region that would become the American South. Wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small elite that owned large plantations worked by enslaved labor. This concentration of wealth and power created an aristocratic social structure based fundamentally on racial hierarchy. White colonists, regardless of their own economic status, were able to define themselves in opposition to people of African descent, creating a social solidarity that transcended economic class lines among white Americans. The cultural and psychological impact of this system cannot be overstated. It created a society where white identity itself became defined by opposition to blackness, where the very concept of freedom and citizenship became associated exclusively with whiteness. This racial ideology would prove to be one of the most potent and enduring elements of American culture, shaping everything from politics to economics to social relationships for generations. The fact that this system was born from the arrival of just 20 or so Africans at Point Comfort in 1619 demonstrates how historical moments that seem small and isolated can have enormous, transformative consequences for entire civilizations. The broader context of 1619 also reveals the complex international forces that shaped the early Atlantic world. The English privateers who captured the San Juan Bautista were operating in a legal gray area that existed in the early 17th century. The Spanish Empire claimed a monopoly on trade with its colonies. Still, English privateers regularly violated this monopoly, arguing that goods taken from Spanish ships represented a legitimate prize of war. This created a chaotic international system in which piracy, privateering, and commercial exploitation blurred, making the Atlantic world a place where human beings could be treated as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded like any other form of property. The Portuguese colonial empire was particularly involved in the early Atlantic slave trade, having established a complex system of forced labor throughout Brazil and other Portuguese territories in the Americas. Portuguese colonists had developed sophisticated methods for capturing, transporting, and selling enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, creating vast networks that extended from Angola to Brazil to the Caribbean. When the English privateers seized the San Juan Bautista, they weren't operating in isolation. They were entering a system that had already been dehumanizing Africans for decades. The psychological trauma experienced by the Africans who arrived in Virginia in 1619 was immense and profound. These men and women had been forcibly removed from their homes, families, and communities. They had been transported across an ocean in conditions that were deliberately designed to break their spirits and create a sense of helplessness and dependence. They had been sold to people whose language they couldn't understand and whose culture was utterly foreign to them. They had been brought to a place where their skills, knowledge, and experiences had no recognized value, and where they were reduced to being treated as property rather than human beings. Yet despite these unimaginably difficult circumstances, the Africans who arrived in 1619 and their descendants managed to preserve significant elements of their cultural heritage while also adapting to the realities of life in colonial Virginia. African religious practices, agricultural techniques, and social structures blended with English and other European traditions to create new, uniquely African-American forms of cultural expression. The food that enslaved Africans cooked, the music they made, the stories they told, and the religious practices they developed would all become essential elements of American culture, even as their creators were denied basic human dignity and recognition. The long-term consequences of the 1619 arrival extended far beyond Virginia itself. As the economic model of plantation slavery spread throughout the American South, it created a form of capitalism that was fundamentally based on the exploitation of human labor. This system generated enormous wealth for plantation owners and their families, while simultaneously creating entire regions of the country that remained largely underdeveloped economically because they were dependent on slave labor rather than free labor. The wealth generated by slavery in the American South would later fuel industrial development in the North and help fund America's emergence as a world power, even as it left the South permanently scarred by the legacy of racial oppression and economic inequality. The political implications of racial slavery were equally profound. The contradiction between America's founding ideals of liberty and equality and the reality of racial slavery created tensions that would ultimately lead to civil war. The question of whether enslaved Africans could be counted as people for purposes of representation in Congress became one of the most contentious issues in early American politics. The framers of the Constitution negotiated a series of compromises designed to preserve the Union while allowing slavery to continue, but these compromises only deepened the underlying contradictions that would eventually tear the nation apart. The arrival of 20-and-odd Africans at Point Comfort in 1619 also had implications for the broader Atlantic world, reshaping relations between European powers and Africa in ways that would be felt for centuries. The English demand for enslaved labor to work Virginia's tobacco plantations contributed to the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade, which in turn accelerated the transformation of West African societies as European traders systematically captured and sold millions of Africans. This systematic dehumanization would ultimately reshape entire regions of Africa, creating generations of social disruption, economic exploitation, and cultural devastation that would outlast the institution of slavery itself. The historical significance of 1619 lies not just in the specific events that occurred, but in the ways that these events would echo through American history for centuries. The racial caste system created by slavery would survive the abolition of slavery itself, continuing to shape American society in the form of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and ongoing patterns of racial discrimination and inequality. The economic system built on slave labor would continue to influence American capitalism, creating regional economic disparities that persist to this day. The political compromises that allowed slavery to continue would ultimately tear the nation apart in the Civil War, a conflict that claimed more American lives than any other war in the nation's history. The personal stories of the individuals who arrived in 1619 represent one of the most tragic aspects of this historical moment. We know some of their names and have fragmentary information about their lives. There was Antonio, who arrived on one of the privateer ships. There was possibly Angela, a woman who may have been among the group. There were others whose names we will never know, whose lives and experiences were reduced to footnotes in the grand narrative of American history. These individuals were forced to become unwilling participants in one of history's most significant transformations, their suffering and resistance playing out against the backdrop of a world being reshaped by European colonialism and the growing system of racial oppression. The resistance and survival of Africans and African Americans in the face of this dehumanizing system represent one of the most inspiring and important aspects of American history. Despite being denied legal recognition as human beings, despite being separated from their families, their communities, and their cultures, and despite being subjected to violence and exploitation beyond imagination, people of African descent managed to create communities, cultures, and forms of resistance that would ultimately contribute to the destruction of the very system that sought to enslave them. The Underground Railroad, the Civil Rights Movement, the struggle for equality and justice, all of these represent continuations of the resistance that began when those first 20-and-odd Africans arrived at Point Comfort and refused to be reduced to mere property. The question of why and how America was fundamentally shaped by the arrival of those 20 Africans in 1619 leads us to consider the broader patterns of world history and human behavior. The transition from indentured servitude to racial slavery in colonial Virginia represents one of history's most significant examples of how economic necessity, demographic pressures, and cultural attitudes can combine to create systems of oppression that fundamentally reshape entire societies. The English colonists who developed Virginia's racial caste system weren't necessarily motivated by racist ideology at first. They were motivated by economic need and political concerns. But by making race itself the basis for labor exploitation, they created a system that would produce its own racist ideologies and justify itself through pseudo-scientific theories about human difference. The implications of 1619 for our understanding of American identity and values cannot be overstated. The contradiction between America's founding ideals and the reality of slavery created tensions that continue to shape American politics and society today. The question of whether America is fundamentally a nation of liberty or a country built on oppression, whether Americans are fundamentally people who value equality or people who accept inequality, continues to be debated in contemporary American politics. The events of 1619 remind us that America's identity as a nation was never entirely settled, that the fundamental questions about what America should be and what values it should embody remain contested territory. The broader historical significance of 1619 extends to our understanding of how systems of oppression develop and persist in human societies. The transition from indentured servitude to racial slavery in Virginia demonstrates how legal, economic, and social institutions can gradually grow to create new forms of human exploitation, even when those institutions were not initially designed for that purpose. The racial caste system that emerged from the peculiar institution of slavery shows how societies can develop forms of social organization that create permanent inequalities and justify them through cultural, legal, and religious means. The historical record from 1619 also reveals the complex ways that individuals and groups can resist even the most oppressive systems of exploitation. While we know relatively little about the specific acts of resistance by the Africans who arrived in Virginia in 1619, we do know that slavery in colonial America was constantly contested by those who were enslaved. Resistance took many forms, from individual attempts to escape to collective rebellions, from work slowdowns and sabotage to the development of underground networks to aid escape attempts. These forms of resistance represented not just efforts to secure personal freedom, but efforts to preserve human dignity and cultural identity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The story of 1619 also illuminates the role of European colonialism in creating the modern world system of racial hierarchy and economic exploitation. The English entry into the Atlantic slave trade was driven not by any grand strategic plan, but by opportunistic piracy and commercial exploitation. Yet this opportunistic entry would ultimately reshape the entire English-speaking world and contribute to the creation of one of history's most potent and enduring systems of racial oppression. This demonstrates how historical transformations can result from the interaction of individual decisions and immediate economic pressures, rather than from carefully planned long-term strategies. The economic transformation that began in 1619 with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans would ultimately reshape the entire Atlantic economy and contribute to the emergence of modern capitalism. The plantation system created by slavery represented one of the first large-scale applications of industrial methods to agricultural production, using forced labor to produce commodities for global markets. The wealth generated by this system would help fund the development of cities, the expansion of trade networks, and the technological innovations that would characterize the modern economy. At the same time, the concentration of wealth and power that resulted from the plantation system would create social and political tensions that continue to influence economic policy and social relationships today. The cultural transformations that began with the arrival of the 20-odd Africans at Point Comfort would also profoundly and lastingly reshape American culture. The forced mixing of African and European cultures in colonial America created new forms of music, food, language, and religious practice that would become essential elements of American culture. The experience of racism and resistance to racism would create new forms of cultural expression and political organization that would challenge dominant American values and push the country toward greater equality and justice. These cultural developments demonstrate how systems of oppression can paradoxically contribute to the creation of new forms of human creativity and social innovation. The historical analysis of 1619 reveals the complex ways that individual decisions, economic pressures, and social forces combine to create major historical transformations. The English privateers who captured the San Juan Bautista weren't thinking about making a permanent system of racial slavery when they sold their human cargo at Point Comfort. The Virginia colonists who began using enslaved labor to work their tobacco fields weren't necessarily motivated by racist ideology when they made this economic decision. Yet their individual decisions, driven by immediate economic needs and opportunities, would ultimately contribute to the creation of one of history's most significant and enduring systems of human oppression and exploitation. The arrival of 20-odd Africans at Point Comfort in 1619 represents a pivotal moment when several streams of historical development converged to create a new system of social organization. The economic needs of Virginia's tobacco planters, the labor shortages that threatened colonial prosperity, the demographic pressures created by the growing population of indentured servants, and the opportunities presented by the Atlantic slave trade all came together to create conditions that made racial slavery both economically profitable and socially acceptable. The convergence of these factors demonstrates how historical transformations often result from the interaction of multiple forces rather than from single causes or deliberate planning. The long-term consequences of 1619 extend to our understanding of how systems of oppression can become embedded in social, economic, and political institutions, making them seem natural and inevitable. The racial caste system that developed from slavery would persist long after the legal institution of slavery was abolished, continuing to shape American society in the form of discriminatory laws, segregated institutions, and ongoing patterns of racial inequality. The economic system built on slave labor would continue to influence regional development patterns and contribute to the creation of social and economic disparities that persist to this day. The political compromises that allowed slavery to continue would ultimately lead to constitutional crises and civil conflict that would reshape American politics for generations. The story of 1619 also demonstrates how the actions of individuals can have consequences that extend far beyond their own intentions and understanding. The English privateers who seized the San Juan Bautista were thinking about immediate profit, not about the long-term consequences of their actions for American society. The Virginia colonists who purchased enslaved Africans were thinking about immediate economic needs, not about how their decisions would contribute to the creation of racial hierarchies and social conflicts that would shape the nation's future. Yet their individual choices, motivated by immediate concerns, would ultimately contribute to the creation of historical forces that would reshape the entire world. The historical significance of 1619 lies ultimately in its representation of how a pivotal moment can crystallize and accelerate broader patterns of historical development. The arrival of those 20 and odd Africans at Point Comfort didn't create slavery in the Americas. That institution already existed in various forms throughout the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. 1619 marks the moment when the English colonies of North America began developing their own version of this system. This version would ultimately become the dominant force in shaping the social, economic, and political development of what would become the United States of America. The enduring legacy of 1619 reminds us that America's identity as a nation was never entirely settled, that the fundamental questions about liberty, equality, and justice remain ongoing struggles rather than settled conclusions. The contradiction between America's founding ideals and the reality of slavery created tensions that would drive the nation's development for centuries, leading to civil war, civil rights movements, and ongoing struggles for racial equality and social justice. The events of 1619 thus represent not just the beginning of slavery in English America, but the beginning of America's ongoing struggle to reconcile its ideals with its realities. The historical analysis of 1619 reveals the complex interplay of individual agency and structural forces in shaping historical outcomes. While the specific events of that August day in 1619 were shaped by the decisions of particular people, privateers, colonists, merchants, and enslaved Africans themselves, these decisions were embedded in larger patterns of economic development, demographic change, and social transformation that were reshaping the entire Atlantic world. The intersection of individual choices and structural forces in 1619 demonstrates how historical moments of crisis and opportunity can accelerate larger processes of social change. The story of how 20 and odd Africans arrived at Point Comfort in 1619 and forever changed the course of American history represents one of history's most powerful examples of how seemingly small events can have enormous consequences. The immediate human tragedy of those individuals being forcibly removed from their homes and sold into bondage represents one of humanity's darkest chapters. Yet their arrival and the system of oppression that would develop from it would ultimately contribute to the creation of some of humanity's most important struggles for freedom, equality, and justice. The paradox of how oppression can generate resistance and how slavery can ultimately contribute to the expansion of human freedom represents one of history's most profound and enduring lessons about the human condition. The enduring significance of 1619 lies not just in what happened on that day, but in what those events represent about the ongoing human struggle to create societies grounded in freedom, equality, and justice. The contradiction between America's founding ideals and the reality of slavery created tensions that would drive the nation's development for centuries. From the Revolutionary War to the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. The story of 1619 thus represents both America's original sin and the beginning of its ongoing quest for redemption, a quest that continues to shape American politics and society today as the nation struggles to live up to its founding ideals of liberty and equality for all people. In the final analysis, the arrival of 20-and-odd Africans at Point Comfort in 1619 represents a moment when the future of America was fundamentally altered, when the seeds were planted for a system of racial oppression that would shape the nation for centuries, but also when the foundation was laid for some of humanity's greatest struggles for freedom and justice. The complexity and contradiction of this historical moment, how it represents both the beginning of oppression and the beginning of resistance, reflects the broader complexity of human history itself, where darkness and light, oppression and liberation, tragedy and hope are always intertwined in ways that make the future both uncertain and full of possibility. The story of 1619 ultimately reminds us that America has never been a finished product, that the nation's identity and values have always been contested territory, and that the struggle to create a more perfect union continues in every generation. The arrival of those 20-and-odd Africans at Point Comfort was not just the beginning of slavery in America, but the beginning of America's ongoing effort to reconcile its ideals with its realities, to confront its contradictions, and to work toward a more just and equal society for all people. This ongoing struggle represents perhaps the most important and enduring legacy of that fateful day in 1619, when 20-and-odd Africans stepped onto the shores of Virginia and changed the course of American history forever.